In the 41st millennium, or rather, in the final bleeding hours of the 31st, the laws of loyalty were already bending toward breaking. 10,000 years before the age of endless war calcified into doctrine, before the Codex Astartes became scripture, and the emperor became a corpse god on a golden chair, there existed a single window of possibility so narrow that most historians who later reconstructed those days refused to believe it had ever been open at all. They were wrong. It was open. And through it, like a blade drawn in darkness, came the First Legion. The augur stations on Luna detected them first. 17 capital ships, 43 escorts, the distinctive silhouette of the invincible reason at the formation's heart. Her flanks scarred from engagements that Terra's strategium had no record of. Her running lights burning in the dark between worlds like the eyes of something ancient and utterly patient. The duty officer on watch, a young woman named Praexa Solin, whose name would appear in no history, whose hands shook as she confirmed the reading 3 times before she allowed herself to believe it, sent the alert up the chain of command with the same coded urgency reserved for confirmed hostile contact. Because nobody had told Terra the lion was coming. That was the thing that made every hand reach for a weapon, every Vox channel erupt in simultaneous alarm and desperate cross-referencing of fleet manifests and deployment orders. In the month since Istvan, since the galaxy split open along the fault line of Horus's ambition, every Primarch's location was tracked with religious obsession. Dorn, the Praetorian, in the architect of Terra's increasingly desperate defenses, had built a picture of the war from the movements of his brothers, like a cartographer mapping a continent by the rivers of blood draining through it. He knew where Guilliman was. He knew, roughly, where Sanguinius was. He knew who had fallen and who stood and who remained, maddeningly silent. The lion had been silent, not unusual for the first. Lionel Jonson had made silence into an art form so refined it bordered on the supernatural. His campaigns communicated through results, not dispatches. His intentions arrived, if they arrived at all, as accomplished facts. Among his brothers, he had always been the one standing slightly outside the firelight, face unreadable, watching, always watching, with those dark eyes that seemed to be calculating something several moves beyond whatever anyone else could see. Some loved him for it, most found it unsettling. A few, in the privacy of their own council, had wondered whether a Primarch so gifted at concealment had something in the end worth concealing. Those fears were in every Vox transmission that crackled between Luna and Terra in the 12 minutes it took Dorn's senior staff to establish that the fleet was authentic, the transponder codes were legitimate, and that Lionel Jonson, Primarch of the First Legion, Lord of Caliban, had brought his entire available battle group to the Sol system without a single advance warning, explanation, or request for permission. The response Dorn sent was characteristically precise. No fanfare, no celebration. A single Vox channel opened directly to the Invincible Reason's command deck, and the Praetorian's voice, granite wrapped in exhaustion, asked 4 words. "Why are you here?" The lion's response came after a pause, long enough that Dorn's staff exchanged glances across the strategium floor. Long enough that fingers tightened on sidearms in rooms across the defense network. Long enough that Praexa Solin, still at her station on Luna, later told her daughters she had spent those seconds genuinely uncertain whether the galaxy was about to end a different way than expected. Then the lion spoke, and his voice carried through the vox with the quiet certainty of a man who has been right about something terrible for a very long time and finds no satisfaction in it whatsoever. "Because Horus is coming," the lion said, "and you need me more than you distrust me. I am coming aboard. Have the sigillite present, and Rogel, do not make this difficult." The channel closed. In the strategium, nobody moved for a full 3 seconds. Then Rogel Dorn turned to his equerry and said, very quietly, "Get Malcador, and increase the Eternity Gate's defensive rating to maximum." He paused. "Both measures are necessary. I am not yet certain for the same reason." In the void above Terra, the invincible reason continued her approach. Patient, scarred, and carrying in her command deck a Primarch who had crossed half a burning galaxy to stand at a gate he already knew, with the cold certainty of the strategist's art, was going to be the hardest thing any of them had ever been asked to hold. If you hunger for stories that ask what one different choice could have changed about everything, about the heresy, about the Imperium, about the darkness that followed, then subscribe, because the crusade for truth is long, and we have only just drawn our swords. The lion was coming to Terra, and nothing, not suspicion, not politics, not the weight of 10 legions of traitors bearing down on the cradle of humanity, was going to make that simple. The imperial palace had been many things across the long centuries of its existence: a monument, a seat of power, a cathedral to human ambition rendered in marble and adamantium and the bones of mountains. In the years since the heresy's opening wounds, it had become something else entirely: a fortress in the truest, most desperate sense of the word. And every corridor had been assessed for defensive utility. Every gallery had been measured for fields of fire. The gardens where the emperor had once walked with his sons had been torn up and replaced with overlapping bunker networks and ammunition caches deep enough to supply a decade of siege warfare. It was through this place, transformed, scarred, humming with the barely suppressed anxiety of a million defenders who understood exactly what was coming for them, that Lionel Jonson walked without escort. He had refused the honor guard, politely, which surprised people. The lion's politeness always surprised people. They expected the bluntness of Perturabo, the fire of Angron, the cold hauteur of Fulgrim. What they got was a dark-haired giant in robes of forest green and bone white, moving through the corridors of the palace with the unhurried certainty of a man who had already memorized every turning, who noted the placement of every gun emplacement and custodian position, with eyes that cataloged and filed and assessed without any visible effort at all. He walked like the palace already belonged to him, not through arrogance, through the simple, unsettling competence of someone who understood space and ground and angles of approach the way musicians understand sound. The custodians watched him pass and said nothing. Their golden faces betrayed nothing, but they watched. Malcador the sigillite was waiting in the investiary. The old man, ancient really, held together by willpower and psychic fortitude and whatever private arrangement he had made with time itself, sat in a plain chair in a room surrounded by statues of the Primarchs. all of them. The ones who had fallen, and the ones who stood, and the ones whose fates remained at this precise moment in history, unwritten. The lion entered and looked at each statue in turn with an expression that gave away nothing. And then he sat down across from Malcador without waiting to be invited, and the two of them regarded each other in silence for a moment that stretched long enough to be its own kind of conversation. "You knew," Malcador said, not an accusation, an observation offered with the weariness of a man who had stopped being surprised by things that should be impossible. "I suspected," the lion said. "Then I knew. There's a difference, and it matters." He folded his hands on the table between them, large hands, sword calloused, perfectly still. "I want to see him." Malcador's expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes. Grief, perhaps, or the particular exhaustion of a man who has been managing impossible situations for so long that even genuine emotion arrives pre-filtered through layers of political calculation. "That is not—" "I am not asking," the lion said, still quiet, still perfectly, dangerously still. "I have crossed the burning wreckage of a galaxy that my brother set on fire. I have watched the Imperium's edges curl and blacken from 100 light years away and been unable to do anything except move faster and trust that there was still something worth reaching. I am here now, and I want to see my father." The silence that followed was different from the one before it, heavier. Malcador took him to the throne room. What the histories would later record about this moment, if they recorded it at all, if the data slates and testimonials survived the fires that were coming, would be inadequate. Language had not been designed to carry the weight of what Lionel Jonson saw when the great doors parted and the full reality of the Emperor's condition resolved itself from rumor and strategic briefing into simple, undeniable fact. He had known intellectually. He had received reports. He had processed the information with the part of his mind that processed everything, cleanly, efficiently, filing it into tactical context. The Emperor was incapacitated. The golden throne was sustaining him. The Astronomicon still burned. These were facts. He had treated them as facts. He was not prepared for the smell. Ozone and incense, and beneath both of those, something older, something that had no name in any of the 47 languages the lion spoke fluently. The smell of a fire burning so hot it had passed beyond heat into something else entirely. He was not prepared for the light, golden and sourceless, and carrying in it a pressure that pressed against the inside of the skull like a thought too large for the mind containing it. He was not prepared for the sound of absolute silence where there should have been breath. He stood at the base of the golden throne for a very long time. He did not kneel. The lion had never been a man who knelt easily, and this moment was, paradoxically and devastatingly, not one that felt like it called for submission. It felt like it called for witness. He stood straight, and he looked at his father with the same eyes he used to read a battlefield. And what those eyes told him was this: the greatest strategic mind in human history had spent its last coherent moments constructing the most perfect trap ever devised, and then had lain down inside it voluntarily. Something in the lion's chest, some mechanism of loyalty and longing, and the specific grief of a son who had always understood his father better than his father knew, made a sound like a sword breaking cleanly across an armored knee. He turned back to Malcador. "Tell me everything," he said. "Every defensive disposition, every traitor fleet vector you have confirmed, every brother whose location is unknown." He paused. "And tell me what Dorn has gotten wrong, because he has gotten something wrong. Men who are certain always do." Malcador almost smiled. "Almost. That," the old man said quietly, "may be the most dangerous sentence spoken in this room in a very long time." The lion waited. He was very good at waiting. Rogel Dorn was not a man who got things wrong. This was not arrogance, or rather, it was not only arrogance. It was the product of a lifetime of rigorous self-assessment, of holding his own judgments up to the cold light of outcome and correcting, always correcting, with the disciplined honesty of a craftsman who cared more about the quality of the work than the comfort of his own pride. Dorn built things that did not fall. He designed defenses that did not break. He had looked at Terra, at this impossible target, this cradle of humanity with its 10,000 years of accumulated vulnerability, and he had seen not what it was, but what it could be made into. And he had spent every waking moment since Istvan making it into exactly that. He was also, the lion had concluded within approximately 4 hours of reviewing the full defensive schematic, wrong about the katabatic gate approach vectors. Not catastrophically wrong. Not in a way that would be obvious until the moment it mattered, which was precisely what made it dangerous. Dorn had assessed the katabatic approach as a secondary threat axis and allocated his reserves accordingly, a decision that was entirely defensible given the intelligence available, given the terrain analysis, given 17 different factors that any competent strategist would have weighted the same way. The problem was a single variable that Dorn had not accounted for, because it required knowing something about Perturabo's doctrine that only someone who had fought beside the Lord of Iron in a very specific campaign during the Great Crusade would know. The lion had fought that campaign. He had watched Perturabo work, and he knew, with the quiet certainty that characterized everything he knew, that the Iron Warriors would hit the katabatic approach with everything they had, because Perturabo had spent 30 years studying the art of breaking exactly the kind of fortification that Dorn had just finished building. And the katabatic vectors were where the math was prettiest for a besieger who thought in equations. He brought this to Dorn in person, because some conversations required presence. The Praetorians' command center occupied what had once been a grand reception hall in the palace's northern wing, its vaulted ceiling now obscured by overlapping tactical hololiths that painted the room in shifting blues and reds, fleet positions, ground force dispositions, projected approach corridors rendered in light and probability. Dorn stood at the center of it like a pillar, golden armored, immovable, surrounded by a staff of Legion officers and Imperial Army commanders who had learned to read his mood from the angle of his shoulders and were currently, collectively, very carefully looking at their data slates. The lion walked in and the room changed temperature. Not literally, but every person in it felt it. The arrival of a second Primarch-level intelligence into a space that had been organized around a single commanding will, the subtle but unmistakable shift in the gravity of the room. Dorn turned. His face was a fortress, as it always was. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept properly in months and had stopped caring about that fact. "You've reviewed the schematics," Dorn said. "Not a question." "The Katabatic Gate," the lion replied. He crossed to the nearest hololith and pulled up the relevant approach corridor, his fingers moving through the light with the ease of a man who had spent more of his life reading tactical displays than sleeping. "You've designated it secondary. It isn't." The silence in the room acquired a specific quality. The silence of people who very much wanted to be somewhere else and had the professional discipline to remain perfectly still instead. Dorn looked at the display, then at the lion. "My assessment is based on terrain analysis, projected fleet approach corridors, and the logical priority of, it's based on Perturabo fighting the way you would fight," the lion said. Not unkindly, not cruelly, with the flat, clean precision of a diagnosis. "He won't. He never has. You build to withstand the maximum possible force at the most logical point of attack. Perturabo builds to make the most logical point of attack irrelevant." He highlighted 3 sub-corridors within the Katabatic approach, tracing the geometry with one finger. "He will come here, here, and here simultaneously, with enough tonnage at each point to make disengaging to reinforce any single one of them a losing proposition. The moment your reserves commit, his 4th wave hits the gate itself." Dorn stared at the display for a long moment. Around them, the staff had stopped pretending to look at data slates. "You're describing a feint within a feint," Dorn said slowly. "I'm describing Perturabo," the lion said. "I watched him break Corin Fortress during the Crusade. The defenders had 6 times the firepower they needed to hold against a conventional assault. They fell in 11 hours because they made exactly the allocation decision your current schematic makes." He paused. "I'm not telling you that you're wrong because I want to be right. I'm telling you because if this gate falls, everything behind it falls with it. And we both know what's behind it." Another silence. This one was different. This one was Rogel Dorn, in private, doing the thing he actually did better than almost any of his brothers, reassessing, correcting, holding his own certainty up to the light, and asking honestly whether it deserved to survive the scrutiny. It was a painful process to watch. Not because Dorn was graceless in it, he wasn't, but because it cost him something visible, something that a man with less integrity would simply have refused to pay. "What do you need?" Dorn said at last. 300 dark angels at the Katabatic Gate," the lion said. "And your 2nd armored reserve I held back from the main axis until I call for them. That weakens the central approach." "Yes." "You're asking me to accept increased risk at the position I've designated as primary. I'm asking you to trust that I've identified the correct primary." The lion held his brother's gaze. "I know what that costs you. I'm asking anyway." The moment stretched between them, 2 of the most gifted military minds humanity had ever produced, on opposite sides of a table in a room full of witnesses, each one fully aware that the other was not an enemy and not quite an ally, and something stranger and more complicated than either. Dorn gave a single, precise nod. 300, he said. And Jonson, he stopped, started again. If you're wrong about this, I'm not, the lion said simply. He turned from the display. But if I am, I'll hold the gate myself until your reserves arrive. You have my word." He left before Dorn could answer, which was, in its own way, a form of mercy. It denied the Praetorian the opportunity to say something that neither of them would have been able to take back. Behind him, in the command center, Rogel Dorn stood looking at the altered schematic for a very long time. Then he began to work. Malcador found the lion on the outer ramparts at the 3rd hour past midnight. This was not coincidental. Very little Malcador did was coincidental. The sigillite moved through the palace's political architecture the way water moved through rock, not by force, but by persistence, finding every crack, every weakness, every unguarded moment in the schedules of men who believed themselves unreadable. He had been doing this for longer than most of the Primarchs had been alive, and he was very good at it. The lion was standing at the rampart's edge, looking out over the vast, illuminated sprawl of the Himalaysian foothills, where the city fortresses that Dorn had raised over the last months glittered in the dark, like a second constellation. Cold light, purposeful light, the light of a civilization that had decided, with the particular stubbornness of things that have survived too long to know how to stop, that it was not finished yet. The wind at this altitude was sharp enough to cut, and it moved through the lion's dark hair and did nothing else to him, because Primarchs were not inconvenienced by weather. Malcador settled into a position beside him with the careful economy of movement that very old men develop when they have made peace with the fact that their bodies are no longer cooperative. For a while, neither of them spoke. The lion did not acknowledge the sigillite's arrival because he had heard him coming from 2 corridors away and saw no reason to perform surprise. He did not feel. "You said Dorn had gotten something wrong," Malcador said eventually. You didn't mention that you intended to tell him so in front of his entire staff." "He needed to hear it in front of his staff," the lion said. "If I'd told him privately, he'd have had the option of discarding it privately. This way, the correction is on record. If the katabatic approach holds, it holds because the schematic was changed, and the people who changed the schematic know why. That information survives even if we don't." Malcador was quiet for a moment. "You think about legacy." "I think about information," the lion said. "Legacy is just information that outlives its source." He turned from the view for the first time and looked at the old man with an expression that was difficult to read, which was, for the lion, not unusual. But there was something beneath the surface of it that Malcador's considerable experience recognized as the specific weight of a question being carried for a long time before being spoken aloud. "You said there was intelligence. In the throne room, when I asked you to tell me everything, you told me deployments, vectors, brother locations. You told me about Horus's fleet composition and the projected arrival window." He paused. "You didn't tell me about the message." Malcador's expression did not change. This was itself a kind of answer. "There was a message," the lion said, "not a question. Received within the last month. Loyalist cipher, but originating from a source within the traitor fleet structure. You've been sitting on it because its implications are either the most important thing anyone in this system knows, or a piece of Alpha Legion misdirection so sophisticated that acting on it would be more dangerous than ignoring it." He watched the old man's face. "I'm right. Infuriatingly so, Malcador said quietly. Show me. The sigillite reached into his robes and produced a data slate, a gesture so analog, so deliberately low technology, that it told the lion something important about how seriously Malcador was taking the possibility of interception. The message on the slate was short, 11 lines. Loyalist encryption wrapped around a core that had been triple verified against known intelligence markers and had still, somehow, retained its capacity to be either genuine or catastrophically false. The lion read it twice. Then he handed the slate back. Mortarion, he said. The message claims he is not beyond reach, Malcador said carefully. That his conversion to Nurgle's service is recent enough, and the Primarch's resistance strong enough, that a direct appeal from a brother he trusts might create sufficient fracture in his allegiance to remove the Death Guard from the siege equation entirely. He paused. Or it is Alpha Legion bait, designed to draw one of our remaining Primarchs into a trap in deep space at the moment when Terra can least afford to lose them. Who could make the approach? In theory, several brothers. In practice, Malcador paused again. Mortarion distrusts most of them for reasons that predate the heresy. Guilliman is too far. Sanguinius is needed here. Dorn won't leave Terra, and shouldn't. The old man looked at the lion with the expression of someone who has already arrived at a conclusion and is watching his companion walk toward it. The message specifically names you. It says, and I want you to understand that I am quoting directly, not editorializing. It says that if the lion comes alone, Mortarion will listen. If anyone else comes, the Death Guard fires first. The wind moved between them. You've been sitting on this, the lion said, because sending me out of the system right now means losing the one Primarch who's identified a critical flaw in Terra's defenses at the moment when those defenses are being finalized. But not sending me means ignoring the possibility of removing an entire legion from the siege. He looked back out over the lights of the fortified city. It's a genuine dilemma. I can see why you found it difficult. Can you? Malcador said. There was something tired in it, something that had been tired for a very long time. Yes. The lion was quiet for a moment. Because it assumes I have to choose between being here and going to Mortarion, and that assumption is only valid if you accept the siege timeline as fixed. He turned. When is Horus's projected arrival window? 31 days, give or take warp variance. I need 17 to reach the Death Guard's last known position. 17 back. He paused. That leaves no margin. No, Malcador agreed. It leaves nothing, which is why I didn't tell you. You didn't tell me, the lion said, because you were afraid I'd go. The sigillite met his eyes. Are you going to? The lion looked at the lights below. All those cold, yet purposeful points of illumination. All those lives organized around the single desperate project of surviving what was coming. He thought about the throne room, about the smell of a fire burning beyond heat, about his father, who had looked at the full scope of human history and made a choice that cost him everything because it was the correct choice. And the lion understood that kind of reasoning in his bones, even when it broke his heart. I don't know yet, he said. It was the most honest thing he had said since arriving at Terra, and Malcador, who had spent 10,000 years in the company of beings who were never uncertain about anything, recognized it as such. They stood together on the rampart for a long time after that, watching the lights of a civilization that was 31 days, give or take warp variance, from the worst moment in its history. Neither of them slept. The Alpha Legion came for the Lion on the 9th day. Not directly. Nothing the Alpha Legion did was direct. Directness was a philosophy they had studied carefully and rejected with the thoroughness of scholars who understood a thing completely before deciding it was beneath them. They came instead through vectors so carefully constructed that they were almost invisible even in retrospect. A Vox operator in the Dark Angel's third company whose loyalty had been compromised on a world 3 systems away, 11 months before anyone knew the heresy was coming. A maintenance servitor in the Invincible Reason's secondary strategium whose neural architecture had been adjusted so subtly that 3 separate Mechanicus adepts had examined it and found nothing. A senior officer in the Imperial Army's Terran defense cohort who genuinely believed he was loyal and was, in every way that his own conscious mind could access, but whose unconscious responses to certain coded Vox frequencies had been carefully, patiently redirected over the course of 2 years of groundwork that had begun before Istvan, before Kalth, before any of the fires were lit. The Alpha Legion had known the Lion was coming before the Lion had decided to come. This was the thing that the Lion discovered on the 9th day, and it hit him with the specific cold force of a tactical revelation that recontextualizes everything preceding it. Not like a blow, but like a light coming on in a dark room, illuminating not something new, but the true shape of something that had always been there. He was sitting in the Invincible Reason's secondary strategium reviewing deployment logistics when the first asset went dark. Sergeant Cassiel, 3rd Company, attached to the Katabatic Gate defensive cohort. Routine Vox check, no response. Followed 11 minutes later by the servitor. Found by a Dark Angel's tech marine in a state of complete neural shutdown, its memory architecture wiped so cleanly it might have been factory fresh. The Lion was moving before the second report finished transmitting. He went to the compromised officer himself, not to question him, or not only that. The Lion understood interrogation as a tool and used it when necessary with the clean efficiency he brought to every tool. But what he wanted in this moment was something more specific than information extracted under duress. He wanted to watch the man's face when he showed him the evidence. He wanted to see the exact moment when a loyal man understood that his loyalty had been used against everything he had given it to protect. The officer's name was Commander Herath Volson. 43 years of service, 3 major decorations, a wife and 2 children in the Himalaysian civilian shelter networks, placed there 6 weeks ago when Dorn's evacuation protocols moved non-combatants into the deep bunkers. He sat across from the Lion in a bare room and looked at the evidence laid in front of him, and his face went through 7 distinct expressions in the space of 4 seconds. Confusion, denial, examination, the terrible arithmetic of a man adding things up and not being able to make the sum come out different no matter how many times he runs it. And then finally something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage but contained elements of both. "I didn't know," Volson said. "I know you didn't," the Lion said. He meant it. That was the point. You were never supposed to know. He leaned forward slightly. I need you to understand something, Commander. What was done to you was not a reflection of your loyalty. It was a reflection of how thoroughly our enemy respects what you're capable of. You don't compromise an asset that isn't valuable. Volson stared at him. Why are you telling me that? Because you're going to help me, the Lion said. And I need you operational, not destroyed. He slid a second data slate across the table. The frequency they use to trigger your responses. I need you to broadcast on it. Specific content, specific timing. They'll believe it's coming from you because it will be coming from you. Understanding moved across Volson's face, followed immediately by something that looked like the particular courage of a man who has just discovered the worst thing about his own history and decided in the same moment not to let it be the last thing. You want to feed them false intelligence. I want to do something more interesting than that, the Lion said. I want to let them think their network is still intact while I roll it up from the edges. Every compromised asset they think they still have will become a mouth telling them exactly what I want Horus to believe about our defensive dispositions. He paused. The Alpha Legion spent years building this network inside our lines, and I intend to spend the next 8 days turning it inside out. What followed was the kind of work that never appeared in the heroic accounts. The exhausting, meticulous, intellectually brutal process of dismantling a shadow network thread by thread, while keeping its shape intact enough to be convincing from the outside. The Lion slept 3 hours in the next 4 days. His officers slept less. They moved through the palace's logistical infrastructure like surgeons, identifying compromised nodes, isolating them, redirecting their outputs, building with painstaking care a false picture of Terra's defenses that looked almost exactly like the real one, except in the 3 places where it mattered most. The katabatic gate dispositions were altered in the false picture, made to look weaker than they were. The Lion had told Dorn what he was doing. Dorn had listened with the expression of a man watching someone perform surgery on something he had built with his own hands, and finding the experience profoundly uncomfortable, but being unable to fault the technique. He had asked one question. If they realize what you're doing, they won't, the Lion said. Not if we're fast enough. And if we're not fast enough, then we'll know, the Lion said, because Horus will hit the katabatic gate with everything he has on the first day, and will have approximately 4 minutes to redeploy before the position is untenable. Dorn had stared at him for a long moment. You find this acceptable? I find it preferable to the alternative, the Lion said, which is Horus hitting the katabatic gate with everything he has on the first day without us knowing it was coming. On the 8th day of the operation, the last compromised node was identified and redirected. The false picture was complete. The Alpha Legion's network inside Terra's defenses was, to all appearances, functioning perfectly, and was, in reality, a mouth speaking words the Lion had written for it. On the 9th day, a signal came back through the network, brief, encoded. It took the Lion ciphers 3 hours to break it because it was wrapped in Alpha Legion encryption so dense it bordered on the artistic. When they finally broke it, it contained 4 words. We see you, Lion. The Lion read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at it for a long moment with an expression that his officers couldn't quite interpret. Not fear, not anger. Something that was almost, in the most unsettling possible way, satisfaction. "Good," he said quietly. He began writing his response. The response he wrote was not words. It was a fleet disposition, or rather, the appearance of one. A carefully constructed tactical fiction broadcast through the last functioning thread of the Alpha Legion's compromised network, depicting 3 Dark Angels, strike cruisers, repositioning to the system's outer edge on what looked, from the outside, like a routine patrol adjustment. Unremarkable. The kind of minor logistical movement that happened a dozen times a day in a system bracing for siege. The kind of thing an intelligence network would note and file, and not elevate to priority status unless someone was specifically looking for it. The Lion was counting on them not looking too closely. Because the 3 strike cruisers were real, and they were moving to the outer edge, and their orders were real. But their cargo was not what the Alpha Legion's intercepted manifests suggested. Instead of the routine rotation of Legion serfs and supply containers that the falsified records indicated, each ship carried a single company of Dark Angels Terminators, void-hardened and briefed with the specific, clipped precision that the First Legion brought to operations where margin for error was measured in seconds rather than minutes. Their target was a debris field at the system's edge, a scattered band of dead rock and shattered moonlets that had been, for the last 11 days, slowly accumulating a very interesting collection of ships. Small ships, dark ships, running without transponders and with their heat signatures suppressed to levels that should have been undetectable. Should have been. The Lion had found them on the 6th day of the network operation, buried in Auspec's data that 17 different analysts had reviewed and classified as sensor ghost returns from the debris field's natural electromagnetic interference. He had looked at the same data for 40 seconds and identified the pattern that made the ghost returns resolve into silhouettes, because the pattern was one he recognized: the specific electromagnetic footprint of ships running Lernaean pattern stealth systems, which were Alpha Legion technology so classified that most of the Imperium didn't know they existed. The Lion knew they existed because he had recovered one from a battlefield in the early Crusade and spent 6 weeks personally overseeing its analysis before submitting a report to the Primarch, whose legion had built it. Halfarius had thanked him for the thorough report. The Lion had always suspected the thanks was genuine, which made it in retrospect worse. The Terminators hit the debris field at the precise moment the Alpha Legion's analysts would have been processing the manifests and concluding the strike cruisers carried nothing worth engaging. 17 infiltrator vessels were boarded simultaneously. The fighting was close and brutal and mercifully brief. Dark Angels Terminators in the confined corridors of stealth ships designed for crews of 12 were not an equation that resolved in favor of the crew, regardless of their training. The Lion monitored the operation from the Invincible Reason's command deck with the focused stillness of a man watching a trap close that he has spent 10 days setting. 12 of the 17 ships were cleared and their intelligence archives seized within the first hour. The other 5 self-destructed. The Lion had expected 3. He noted the discrepancy and filed it. What the surviving archives contained was, by any measure, extraordinary. Operational timelines, insertion points, a list of secondary assets within the palace's civilian infrastructure that the network sweep had missed because they were so deeply embedded they had never activated. Sleeper agents so patient they might have spent their entire lives in place without being called upon, waiting for a single moment that might never come. The lion read through the intelligence with the speed of a man whose comprehension outpaces most beings' ability to generate the text he is reading. And what assembled itself in his mind as he read was not a picture of an infiltration operation, but something larger and more patient and more philosophically interesting than a simple intelligence network. The Alpha Legion had not been trying to sabotage Terra's defenses, not primarily. Sabotage was a component. The compromised assets, the false sensor returns, the sleeper agents. But it was a component in service of something else. Something that required the siege to proceed to a specific point before the network was activated in full. The lion read the operational timeline 3 times, following the logic of it, and what he found at the end of that logic was a scenario in which Terra fell not to Horus's overwhelming force, but to a single, perfectly timed moment of internal collapse. The palace's command infrastructure disrupted at the exact instant when Horus's ground forces breached the outer walls, creating a window of confusion long enough to matter. They weren't trying to win the siege for Horus. They were trying to make sure that even if Horus lost, certain things survived the siege in certain conditions. What things and why, and in service of what long-term objective that stretched beyond the heresy itself. These questions opened beneath the lion's analysis like shafts into unmeasurable darkness. He brought it to Malcador. The sigillite read the same intelligence and considerably longer, but arrived at the same conclusion, and his face, when he looked up from the data slate, was the face of a man who has just confirmed a suspicion he had been hoping was wrong. "They're playing a longer game," Malcador said. "They always are," the lion said. "The question is whether we need to understand the game to counter it, or whether dismantling the network is sufficient. You've dismantled the network. I've dismantled the part of the network I could find." He met the old man's eyes. "The sleeper assets are different. They're not connected to the operational structure I rolled up. They're isolated, insulated, triggered by a signal we haven't identified yet. If I had another month, you don't have another month." "No," the lion was quiet. 22 days by current projection. The number sat between them with the specific gravity of a deadline. "There's something else," the lion said. He had been deciding, across the 4 hours since reading the archive, whether to say this, and he had decided yes, not because it was comfortable, but because Malcador was one of perhaps 3 people in the galaxy who could receive this particular information and respond to it usefully. The operational timeline references a contingency, designated in their cipher as the Ouroboros Protocol. It activates under a specific condition, one that has nothing to do with the siege's outcome. He paused. It activates if a Primarch dies on Terra. Malcador's expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. "Any Primarch?" the old man said carefully. "Any Primarch," the lion confirmed. "The protocol's content isn't in the archive, just the trigger condition and a single coordinate set." He slid the relevant data across the table. I've been looking at that coordinate for 2 hours. I think you should look at it too. I think you already know what's there." Malcador looked at the coordinate for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet and very careful, and carried in it the weight of a man who has been keeping a secret so long it has become structural. Remove it, and something load-bearing collapses. "Yes," the sigillite said, "I know what's there." He did not say what it was. The lion did not ask. Not yet. There were 22 days left, and he had learned in a long life of careful patience that some questions were best held until the moment when the answer could be acted upon. He filed it. He waited. Outside, Terra turned in the dark, and somewhere beyond the system's edge, in the burning immensity of the warp, a fleet of impossible scale moved toward them with the slow, inexorable certainty of an ending that had decided it was no longer willing to wait. Perturabo arrived 16 days before Horus. This was not in any projection, not in Dorn's models, not in the sigillite's intelligence assessments, not in the lion's own calculations, which was itself a datum of significance, because the lion's calculations had been wrong about very few things since arriving at Terra, and the wrongness here had a specific flavor that he recognized and respected. It meant Perturabo had done something genuinely unexpected, not irrational. The Lord of Iron was never irrational, but unexpected, which in a strategist of that caliber was considerably more dangerous than irrational would have been. Irrational could be modeled. Unexpected meant someone had found a variable you hadn't accounted for and used it with precision. What Perturabo had done was simple, in the way that the most devastating ideas are always simple in retrospect. He had split his fleet. Not evenly, that would have been obvious. He had sent the larger portion on the projected approach vector, burning hard and loud, and broadcasting the kind of electromagnetic signature that said, "We are an invasion fleet, and we are not hiding," which had drawn every Auspex array in the system and held them with the gravitational pull of an obvious threat. The smaller portion, 43 ships, Iron Warriors colors masked behind salvaged transponder codes from a loyalist fleet destroyed at Istvan, had come in along the system's ecliptic plane at a declination so shallow it registered as background noise until it was inside Jupiter's orbital path. By the time the deception resolved on Terra's auger stations, the Vanguard was already engaging the outer defense platforms. The Lion was in the strategium when the alerts came through, and the first thing he did, before responding to any of them, before the room had finished erupting into controlled chaos around him, was pull up the Katabatic Gate's defensive disposition and verify with his own eyes that the 300 Dark Angels he had placed there were in position, and the reserve armor was held back exactly as he had specified. They were. It was. He allowed himself 1 second of something that was not quite relief. The Lion did not traffic much in relief, which required a degree of emotional investment in outcomes that he had learned over centuries to defer until outcomes were confirmed. And then he was moving, in issuing orders with the rapid, layered precision of a mind that could hold 17 simultaneous tactical problems and address them in the correct sequence without appearing to hurry. The outer platforms fell in 4 hours. This was expected. They were designed not to hold, but to bleed, to extract maximum cost from an attacker while the inner defensive lines consolidated, to force any besieging fleet to spend ordnance and time and ships on positions that were, by design, expendable. Dorn had built them with the cold arithmetic of a man who understood that some things had to be sacrificed to make the defense of others possible, and the crews who manned them had known this when they took their posts and had taken them anyway. The Lion noted this, as he noted everything, and filed it in the part of himself that was not strategy, but something older and less comfortable. The ground forces came on the third day, iron warriors in numbers that made the Strategium's casualty projections recalculate 3 times before settling on figures that nobody read aloud. They came with siege equipment that had no standard Imperial designation because it had been designed specifically for this assault. Crawling fortress engines, vast and methodical, that advanced on the outer wall networks with the patient, grinding certainty of geological processes. Behind them, ranked in perfect Iron Warriors order, came the infantry, Legion Astartes in battered silver and iron plate, veterans of 100 sieges, moving with the economical precision of men who had done this so many times that siege warfare had stopped being a skill and become a reflex. Dorn met them at the outer walls personally. The Lion did not. He was at the Katabatic Gate. He had been there since the first ground forces made landfall, because the false intelligence he had fed through the Alpha Legion's network had done its work. Perturabo's assault was weighted toward the positions the compromised data had identified as weakest, which were not the positions that were actually weakest, and the Katabatic approach was receiving exactly the weight of attention the Lion had predicted it would. 4 full companies of Iron Warriors, supported by siege armor and a battery of Medusa siege guns, positioned in the ruins of what had been, 3 weeks ago, a transit hub for civilian evacuee processing. The 300 Dark Angels held. Not easily. The word easily did not belong anywhere in the vicinity of what happened at the Katabatic Gate across the next 72 hours. It was the kind of fighting that produced no memorable moments, no heroic last stands, no dramatic reversals, because it was too continuous and too brutal to resolve into discrete events. It was attrition in the purest sense, both sides spending lives against a fixed point, and the question was not who fought better, but whose mathematics worked out. The Lion was present for all of it, not as a commanding officer directing from a position of safety, but as a combatant, because the Lionel Jonson had not survived Caliban and the Great Crusade by understanding war only theoretically, and because there were moments when the most strategically valuable thing a commander could do was be visible. He killed 41 Iron Warriors in those 72 hours. He counted because counting was a form of respect, and he was not a man who killed carelessly. On the 4th day, Perturabo himself appeared at the Katabatic approach. The Lion felt it before he saw it. A shift in the assault's rhythm, a sudden increase in precision and coordination that had the unmistakable quality of a master craftsman taking personal control of a tool that journeymen had been using competently, but not optimally. He climbed to the gate's highest observation point and looked out across the killing ground, and found the Lord of Iron standing 700 meters away in full Terminator plate, surrounded by his Iron Circle bodyguard, studying the gate's defenses with the focused attention of an engineer examining a problem he finds genuinely interesting. Perturabo looked up. Across 700 meters of rubble and bodies and the settling dust of artillery exchanges, their eyes met. The lion drew the lion sword. What followed was not a duel in any formal sense. The gap between them was too large, and the battlefield too active for it to resolve into single combat immediately. There were still thousands of combatants between them, still artillery cycling through its reload sequences, still the ongoing brutal mathematics of a siege engagement that had no interest in pausing for symbolism. But something changed in the assault's character in that moment, something that every soldier on both sides felt without being able to articulate it. A focusing of intent, see a drawing down of scope, the siege contracting around 2 points of will until everything else became context. Perturabo began moving toward the gate. The lion began moving to meet him. They came together in the rubble of what had been the gate's outer processional, a space designed for ceremony, for the passage of dignitaries and triumphal processions, now a broken terrain of shattered marble and overturned statuary. Bodies of dark angels and iron warriors mingled without distinction in the dust. The iron circle moved to intercept. The lion's equerry, Brother Holgast, moved with 6 Deathwing Terminators to match them, and the sounds of that secondary engagement became a backdrop to something that required, for both participants, a quality of focus that excluded everything peripheral. Perturabo fought like a siege made flesh. There was no elegance in it. He had never cared about elegance. But there was a terrifying structural logic, each attack building on the last, probing for load-bearing weaknesses, applying pressure with the methodical patience of a craftsman who understood that any defense, given sufficient time and correctly applied force, would eventually resolve into its component failures. The lion fought like a forest, patient, deep-rooted, and full of things that moved without warning in the dark. They were extraordinarily well matched, which surprised neither of them. It ended not with a killing blow, but with a moment of mutual recognition. Perturabo's hammer arrested 6 centimeters from the lion's pauldron, the lion's sword's tip resting against the gap between Perturabo's gorget and chest plate, both of them perfectly still in a tableau of balanced lethality. "You changed the schematic," Perturabo said. He was not breathing hard. Neither was the lion. "The katabatic weighting in the intelligence we received was false." "Yes," the lion said. "You fed it through our own network." "Yes." A pause. In Perturabo's eyes, visible through the Terminator helm's lenses, something that was not admiration exactly, but occupied the same general territory. "How long have you known about the network?" the Lord of Iron asked. "Long enough," the lion said. Then, because it was the truth, and because he respected Perturabo enough to give him the truth. 9 days. Another pause. Longer. "Horus is coming," Perturabo said, "regardless of what happens here." "I know," the lion said. "Step back, brother. Take your legion and pull back to the outer cordon. What comes next doesn't require you to die for it." The word brother landed between them in the dust and the ruin, and neither of them looked at it directly. "You think I can be reasoned with," Perturabo said. "I think," the lion said carefully, that you are the only one of Horus's allies who joined him for reasons that had nothing to do with faith or ambition or corruption, and everything to do with grievance. And I think your grievance, while real, does not require 10,000 dark angels and 1 billion Imperial lives to resolve. He held the Lord of Iron's gaze. Stand down. We can discuss what comes after, when there is an after. The silence that followed lasted long enough for 3 separate artillery exchanges to cycle somewhere behind them. Then Perturabo stepped back. The lion sword withdrew. I make no promises, the Lord of Iron said. I'm not asking for promises, the lion said. I'm asking for time. Perturabo turned and walked back toward his lines. The iron circle fell in around him. The assault on the Katabatic gate, with a raggedness that suggested the order to disengage had been neither expected nor fully obeyed in its first moments, began to slow. The lion stood in the broken processional and watched him go and did not allow himself to feel anything about it yet, because there was no time yet for feeling, and because what had just happened was either the most important thing that would occur in this siege, or a complication whose full weight would not resolve until Horus arrived. He sheathed the lion sword and went back to the gate. There was still work to do. Horus came on the 14th day, not with subtlety, not with the careful, layered approach of Perturabo's engineering, or the invisible threading of Alpha Legion infiltration. Horus Lupercal, Warmaster of Chaos, favored the entrance of a being who had decided, somewhere in the long journey from beloved son to architect of apocalypse, that he was done performing for an audience that did not deserve the performance. His fleet dropped from the warp like a fist through glass. Sudden, total, the kind of emergence that made every auger station in the Sol system scream simultaneously and every Vox channel collapse under the weight of overlapping alerts. 400 ships, perhaps more. The counters kept revising upward as the warp's residual distortion cleared and the full scope of the armada resolved itself against the dark. In the strategium, nobody spoke for 11 seconds. Then Dorn's voice came through the Vox, granite steady, and began issuing orders with the precision of a man who had been preparing for this exact moment for months and found, now that it had arrived, that preparation was the only thing standing between him and something that would not help anyone. The lion listened to the orders, assessed them, and found them, with 2 exceptions he flagged immediately, correct. Dorn absorbed the corrections without comment and integrated them into the next cycle of instructions. This was the working relationship they had arrived at across 14 days of siege, not warm and not comfortable, but functional in the way that 2 instruments tuned to the same pitch produce something usable regardless of whether they like each other. The lion was not in the strategium when Horus's ground forces made landfall. He was at the Eternity Gate. He had been moving toward it for 6 hours, since the first projections of Horus's fleet emergence position had suggested a ground assault vector that made the gate the most probable primary target. Not the only target. Horus was too sophisticated to concentrate everything on a single point, but the most symbolically and structurally significant one, and the lion had learned, watching Horus across a century of campaigns, that the Warmaster understood symbol and structure as a unified language. He would hit the Eternity Gate because it was the door to the Emperor's throne room, and because breaking it would break something in the defenders that no subsequent tactical recovery could fully repair. The gate was already under assault when the lion arrived. Sons of Horus in numbers that made the katabatic engagement look preliminary. Black and Eye of Horus green, moving with the fluid, aggressive precision of the First Legion's Dark Mirror. Warriors trained in the same traditions, the same doctrines, shaped by the same hands into instruments of war, so refined they had become something beyond simple soldiers. They moved through the outer processional of the Eternity Gate with the confidence of men who expected to be inside within the hour, and the imperial fists and custodians holding the outer line were giving ground, slowly, fighting for every meter with the savage discipline of defenders who understood what they were defending, but giving it. The lion hit the Sons of Horus flank like a theorem proving itself. There was no announcement, no challenge, no moment of theatrical pause. The Lion L. Jonson fought the way he had always fought, with total commitment and without waste, every movement and expression of a tactical intelligence that operated faster than conscious thought, reading the engagement's geometry in real time and inserting himself into the precise point where his presence would do the maximum damage to the assault's structural coherence. He was through their outer screen before they fully registered he was there, and by the time the Sons of Horus reoriented to address the new threat, he had killed 19 of them and disrupted the assault's left hook completely. The Imperial fists, seeing the flank collapse, counterattacked. The assault on the Eternity Gate stalled. For 40 minutes, the lion held the flank alone, or nearly alone, with a handful of dark angels who had followed him from the katabatic assignment and fought with the grim, purposeful efficiency of men who were used to operating in the shadow of something extraordinary and had learned to be extraordinary themselves in consequence. 40 minutes of the kind of combat that existed at the absolute limit of what transhuman physiology could sustain, where the decisions were not tactical anymore, but pure. Each moment resolving into a single binary of move or die, and the lion's body executing answers to that binary so quickly that the conscious mind was almost a passenger. Then the second wave arrived, larger, and at its head, in Terminator plate that had been white once and was now the deep, a corrupted green of something that had passed through transformation and come out changed in ways that went beyond color, came Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Sons of Horus, the Warmaster's blade, a warrior of such profound and genuine capability that the lion, assessing him across the killing ground with the cold clarity that extreme situations produced in him, felt the first genuine spike of tactical concern he had experienced since arriving on Terra. Abaddon fought without the hesitation that conscience produced. This was not a psychotic absence of feeling. The lion had fought psychotics, and this was different. This was something that had decided, with full deliberation, that certain weights would no longer be carried, and had set them down on, and was consequently lighter and faster and more terrible than anything that still carried them. He came through the lion's defensive position like a tide that had decided geometry was optional, and the lion met him with the lion's sword, and the engagement that followed was brutal in a way that even the previous 40 minutes had not been. They fought for 11 minutes. The lion was winning, marginally, effortfully, with the kind of grinding technical superiority that would resolve into a kill given sufficient time. When the charge detonation happened, it came from below, from the gate's sub-foundation network, where the Alpha Legion sleeper assets the Lion had failed to identify had been patient for 14 days, waiting for the signal that the operational timeline designated as the Ouroboros Protocol's activation condition. The condition was a Primarch in proximity to the gate. The Lion's presence had triggered it. The irony of this landed in his mind in the same second that the detonation shockwave hit the gate's outer structural members, and the ancient, magnificent, irreplaceable adamantium framework that Dorn had reinforced across months of desperate work began, in 3 specific load-bearing points, to fail. The gate was not destroyed. It was damaged, critically, precisely in the way that a structure is damaged when someone who understands its engineering has spent years identifying the points where correctly applied force produces maximum consequence. The outer blast doors lost integrity. The secondary void shield generators went offline. The gate could still be held, but holding it now required something it had not required 60 seconds ago. It required someone to stand in the gap, physically, in the space where the blast doors had failed, against the full weight of a Sons of Horus assault that was already reforming after the detonation. Until the damage control teams could effect emergency repairs or reinforcements arrived from the Central Reserve. The Lion looked at the gap, then at Abaddon reforming his assault, then at the damage control teams, 12 minutes away at minimum, more likely 20. Then at the Central Reserve disposition in his tactical overlay, which told him that pulling them to the gate would open a hole in the northern wall approach that would cost more than it saved. He looked at the gap again. The dark angels around him were already moving to form a defensive line across it. 16 warriors, armored and determined and insufficient. The Lion ran the mathematics of 16 Astartes against what was coming and arrived at a number he did not like. He voxed Dorn, not to ask permission, to inform. "The Eternity Gate's outer integrity is compromised," he said. "I'm holding the gap. I need your Northern Reserve redirected to reinforce the sub-foundation after the repair teams clear the blast site. Do not send them to me." A pause. "Whatever you hear in the next 20 minutes, do not send them to me. I need them on the northern wall." Dorn's response was immediate. "Lion, the northern wall," the Lion said. He closed the Vox channel. He turned to Brother Holgast, who had been with him since the Katabatic Gate, and whose armor was the color of dried blood over its original green. "Get the men into a wedge formation. I'll take point." "My lord," Holgast said, which was not agreement, but was as close as a Dark Angel's veteran of 50 years' service came to expressing that he understood the situation and had decided to be in it anyway. The Lion L. Jonson walked to the gap in the Eternity Gate's blast doors and turned to face what was coming. Abaddon saw him standing there and stopped advancing for a moment. A single moment of something that might, in a different life, have been reassessment. Then he raised his weapon and came on. The Lion raised the Lion Sword. What followed was witnessed by 47 Dark Angels, 200 Imperial Fists, 11 Custodians, and a damage control servitor whose optical sensors recorded everything without understanding any of it. It lasted 19 minutes and 14 seconds. It cost the lion 2 broken ribs, a deep laceration across the left pauldron that reached the flesh beneath, and the small finger of his sword hand, which was removed at the second knuckle by a strike from Abaddon's claw that the lion did not fully avoid, because avoiding it completely would have required allowing something past him that could not be allowed past him. He held the gap. Abaddon withdrew when the 19th minute ended. Not broken, not defeated, but reassessing with the pragmatic intelligence of a commander who understood that a position defended by whatever the lion was in those 19 minutes was not a position that would be taken by continued frontal pressure. He pulled his assault back to regroup, and the damage control teams came through the gap at a run, and the lion stepped aside and let them work and stood with his back against the gate's surviving frame and looked at his left hand and the place where the finger had been and felt nothing about it yet, because there was not yet time to feel anything about it. Dorn's voice came through the vox. "Northern wall is holding," the Praetorian said. Then, after a pause that lasted long enough to contain something Dorn would never have said directly. "The gap?" "Holding," the lion said. Another pause. "Good," Dorn said. He closed the channel. The lion looked up at the eternity gate above him, ancient, scarred, damaged, but standing, the way everything on Terra was damaged, but standing, and thought about his father sitting behind it on a throne of gold and suffering, and thought about 19 minutes, and thought about the finger, and allowed himself for approximately 4 seconds to feel the full weight of all of it. Then he pushed off the wall and went to find Holgast and asked for a damage report. There was still work to do. Horus came to the surface on the 17th day. The lion had known he would. Not from intelligence. The Warmaster's movements were shielded behind layers of chaos-wrought obfuscation that made conventional augury unreliable, but from the internal logic of the man himself, in which the lion had studied across a century of shared campaigns with the attention of a scholar who understood that the most important text he would ever read was the character of the being most likely to destroy everything he valued. Horus Lupercal had never been a general who directed from safety. He was a commander who understood that there were moments when the presence of a singular will on a battlefield changed the battlefield's fundamental nature, and that those moments required him to be present, and that presence required risk, and that he had never in his life been deterred by risk in any meaningful way. He came down in a stormbird that punched through the palace's outer air defense envelope with the assistance of a chaos-wrought void shield that absorbed 3 separate missile salvos without failing, and he landed in the ruins of what had been the processional of the triumphant, 300 meters from the Eternity Gate, and he stepped out of the Stormbird in Terminator plate that was not armor anymore, in any conventional sense, but something that the warp had touched so thoroughly it had become continuous with its wearer, an expression of Horus's will rendered in ceramite and corruption, and the dark blessing of 4 gods who had decided that this particular instrument was worth protecting. He was magnificent. The lion looked at him across 300 meters of rubble and ruin and felt the full, complicated weight of that. The magnificence of a thing that had been the greatest of them and had chosen with full awareness and genuine deliberation, to become something else entirely. There was grief in it. There was also, the lion acknowledged privately, a profound and terrible anger that had been building for 17 days and had nowhere yet to go. Around Horus, his Juste Aaron Terminators formed a cordon, the finest warriors in the Sons of Horus, veterans of campaigns that had spanned the galaxy, now touched by the same warp corruption that had transformed their Primarch into something that defied clean categorization. They moved with the fluid wrongness of beings whose relationship to physics had become negotiable. The lion walked out to meet him alone. This was not a tactical decision, or rather, it was not only a tactical decision. There was calculation in it. There was always calculation in everything the lion did. But beneath the calculation was something simpler and older and less comfortable. He walked out alone because this was his brother, and because some conversations, regardless of what they had become to each other, regardless of what waited on the other side of the conversation, required that kind of honesty. They met in the rubble of the processional, equidistant between the gate and the Stormbird, in a space that had been designed for triumph and was now a monument to what triumph cost. Horus looked at him, the Warmaster's eyes, those eyes that had always been the most readable thing about him, warm and direct, and carrying in them the specific quality of someone who saw you completely and liked what he saw, were changed. Not entirely gone, but changed. Layered over with something that moved beneath them like deep water moving beneath ice. "I didn't expect you," Horus said. His voice was the same, and this was somehow the worst part. "You were supposed to be in the eastern reaches. That's where my intelligence had you." "Your intelligence was wrong," the lion said. "Clearly." Something moved in Horus's expression. Not quite amusement, but the ghost of the man who had found things amusing, haunting the face of the thing that had replaced him. "How long have you been here?" "Long enough." The katabatic gate. Horus looked at the lion's damaged pauldron, the bandaged hand, the specific pattern of wear and damage that told a story to anyone who knew how to read it. "That was you, and the network. Alfarius told me there was a counter-operation. I didn't believe him." A pause. "I should have." "Yes," the lion said. "You should have." The space between them was very quiet. Around them, at distances that respected the gravity of what was happening without pretending it made them safe, both sides had stopped. Sons of Horus and dark angels and imperial fists and custodians, arranged in a rough perimeter around two Primarchs standing in rubble, all of them understanding without being told that what happened in the next minutes would matter in ways that the fighting around them could not. "Why are you here, lion?" Horus said. Not the earlier question, not the tactical question about timing and positioning. Something underneath that, something genuine. Not strategically, actually, why did you come? The lion considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because I saw it coming," he said, finally. "Before most of the others. I saw the shape of it, not all of it, not the full scope, but enough. Enough to know what you were building and where it ended." He paused. "And because I couldn't decide, for a long time, whether you were wrong." Something shifted in Horus's expression. Genuine surprise underneath everything else. "The Emperor's dream is dying," the lion said. You know that. So do I. The Imperium he built is already becoming something he didn't intend. Rigid, dogmatic, consuming the humanity it was supposed to elevate. You saw it. Your diagnosis was correct. He held the Warmaster's gaze. Your prescription was catastrophically wrong. You chose to burn the patient to cure the disease. And you, Horus said, the deep water moving under the ice. What would you have done? I don't know, the lion said. I genuinely don't know, which is why I'm here instead of there. He indicated, with a slight movement of his unbandaged hand, the space behind Horus rather than behind himself. I couldn't follow you, but I understood you, and I need you to understand something in return. Tell me. He's dying, the lion said. The words cost something. He paid it. Whatever you came here to finish, it's already done. The father we knew is gone. What's on the throne is something else now. Something that might be beyond either of us to understand. You can take the palace. You might even be able to destroy what remains of him. He paused. But you cannot kill what he started. You know that. You've always known that. Kill the emperor and you make him permanent. You make him a god. You give the Imperium 10,000 years of his name to march under. And it will be worse, far worse, than anything he built while he was alive to correct his mistakes. The silence that followed was the longest silence the lion had experienced since arriving at Terra. Horus stood perfectly still. The warp-touched plate absorbed the pale light of the burning sky and gave nothing back. The eyes with the deep water moving under them looked at the lion with an expression that was, and the lion filed this with the same careful precision he filed everything, because it would matter, because everything mattered, not the expression of a man who had not considered this. It was the expression of a man who had considered it and made his choice anyway, and was now, for the first time since that choice, genuinely uncertain whether the choice had been correct. You came here to say that, Horus said quietly, among other things. You knew I would come to the surface. Yes. You walked out here alone to say this to me directly. Yes. Another silence. Then something in Horus's expression that the lion had no clean name for. A fracture line, perhaps, in something that had been held under immense pressure for a very long time. It's too late, Horus said. And the way he said it, the specific timbre of it, the absence of the anger or conviction that should have been there, told the lion something that he absorbed and filed and felt the weight of simultaneously. Is it? The lion said. Horus looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked up at the burning sky, at the fleet dispositions visible through the smoke as distant lights moving in patterns that told their own tactical story. Then back at the lion. You can't win this, Horus said. Not a threat. An observation, offered with something that, in a different context, might have been called honesty. Even with the catabatic gate, even with whatever you did to Perturabo. Don't think I haven't noticed he's pulled back, even with the network dismantled and the gate held and everything you've done since you arrived. The numbers don't resolve in your favor. No, the lion agreed. Not in the conventional sense. Then what are you doing? The lion looked at his brother, at this being that had been his brother, that contained within its corrupted magnificence the ghost of the man who had been the best of them, and said the thing that he had been carrying since the throne room, since standing at the base of the golden throne and understanding, with the full force of a strategic intelligence that had never once in its existence refused a correct conclusion because the conclusion was painful, what his father had actually built. "I'm buying time," the lion said, "not for Terra, for what comes after Terra, for the possibility that something survives this, that's worth surviving." He paused. "And I'm asking you one final time, as your brother, not as a loyalist, not as the Emperor's instrument, but as the one who understood you well enough to see what you were going to do before you did it, to stop." The word landed in the rubble between them. Horus looked at it for a long time. Then the Warmaster of Chaos raised the talon of Horus, and the deep water moved under his eyes, and he said, very quietly, the saddest thing the lion had ever heard him say. "I can't." The lion drew the lion's sword, and the battle at the heart of everything began. They fought for 2 hours in the ruins of the processional, and what happened between them in those 2 hours was witnessed and partially recorded, and mostly not believed by the people who recorded it, because the full account required accepting that 2 beings of that magnitude could come together in genuine combat and produce something that was simultaneously catastrophic, and, in some way that defied easy articulation, necessary, like a storm that destroys and cleanses in the same motion. The lion fought with everything he had, and everything he had was extraordinary, and it was not enough to kill Horus, because Horus Lupercal, with the full blessing of 4 chaos gods, was not something that could be killed by extraordinary alone. But it was enough to do something else. The lion's sword found the gap between Horus's corrupted plate and the warp flesh beneath it in the 93rd minute of their engagement, driven by a combination of technical mastery and the specific advantage of a fighter who had been studying his opponent for a century and had been saving one observation for exactly this moment. The wound it made was not fatal, but it was real, genuinely, physically real, in a way that chaos-blessed flesh was supposed to be immune to, and the shock of it moved through Horus in a way that both of them felt, the sudden terrible reminder that underneath everything he had become, there was still something mortal. Horus stepped back. He looked at the wound, then at the lion. "How?" he said. "I watched you fight for 100 years, the lion said. He was breathing hard. "You drop your right shoulder a quarter second before a killing blow. You've always done it. No one else ever mentioned it because no one else expected to survive long enough for it to matter." Another silence, the longest yet. Then Horus laughed. It was, and this was the thing the witnesses would argue about for as long as any of them lived, genuine. A real laugh, carrying in it something from before all of this, from the man who had stood at Ulanor and been named the greatest of them and had deserved the name. "Only you," Horus said, "only you would notice that and wait a century to use it." "I needed the right moment," the lion said. The laughter faded. What replaced it was not the deep water, was not the chaos corruption that had layered itself over everything, but something underneath even that, something human, in the oldest and most painful sense of the word. "It changes nothing," Horus said quietly. "No," the lion agreed, "but it needed to happen anyway." He lowered the lion's sword, not in surrender, in acknowledgement. "Then let's finish it," Horus said. The Justaran moved forward. The dark angels and imperial fists came from the other direction, and the battle, which had contracted to a single point of two brothers in rubble, expanded back outward into the general chaos of a siege that was not yet over and would not be over until something irreversible happened. Until the scales tipped in one direction or another through some agency that neither of them, in this moment, controlled. That agency arrived 6 minutes later. It came from the throne room. The light came without warning. Not fire. Not the grinding, purposeful fire of artillery, or the cold light of void weapons, or even the psychic luminescence that accompanied the worst warp phenomena. Something different. Something that had no proper category in any taxonomy of warfare because it had never happened before and would, in the specific form it took in that moment, never happen again. It came from the direction of the throne room, and it moved through the palace's walls as though the walls were suggestions rather than facts. And when it reached the processional, it did not illuminate so much as clarify, stripping away the smoke and the dust and the accumulated visual noise of 17 days of siege until everything it touched became briefly, absolutely visible. Every combatant in the processional stopped. Sons of Horus and dark angels and imperial fists and Justa-Aaron terminators, all of them simultaneously, as though a single hand had closed around the engagement and stilled it the way you still water in a bowl by ceasing to move. The light had that quality. The quality of something so completely outside the register of normal experience that the nervous system, confronted with it, simply suspended its ordinary operations and waited. Horus felt it first. The lion watched it happen, watched the Warmaster's face change in a way that all the combat and all the words and even the wound had not managed to change it. The deep water under the ice moved, but differently this time, moved not with the slow, terrible certainty of something ancient and powerful, but with the sudden violent motion of something that has been struck. Horus looked toward the throne room with an expression that the lion had no name for and had never seen on his brother's face before. An expression that contained, in some precise and devastating combination, recognition and grief, and something that might, if you were very careful about applying the word, be called fear, not of dying, of understanding. He reached out, Horus said, very quietly, to no one in particular, or to himself, or to the man he had been before all of this, who was still somewhere inside the thing he had become, and was, in this moment, closer to the surface than he had been in years. I didn't think he could still. He stopped, started again. I didn't think there was enough of him left. The lion said nothing. He had seen the throne room. He had stood at the base of the golden throne and smelled the air and understood, with his full strategic intelligence brought to bear on a problem that was not strategic at all, that his father's condition was not what it appeared from the outside, that the vast, motionless suffering of the emperor's entombment contained within it something that was neither dead nor diminished, but transformed, operating on registers that conventional assessment could not measure. He had suspected something like this was possible. He had not known. He had filed it under variables unaccounted for and waited. The light faded. What it left behind in Horus's face was a wound more complete than anything the lion's sword had managed. The Warmaster of Chaos stood in the rubble of the processional in his warp-touched plate, surrounded by his Justarin and facing the lion and the gate he had come to break, and he looked, for the first time in 17 days of siege and a decade of galactic civil war, like a man who was not certain. The lion sheathed the lion sword. Around them, the combatants remained still, waiting. "Horus," the lion said, quietly, the way you speak to someone standing at the edge of something from which there is no return, when you are not certain whether they have stepped off yet. Horus looked at him. "He still knows you," the lion said. "Whatever he is now, whatever the throne has made of him, he still knows you. That light was not an attack." He held his brother's gaze. "You know what it was." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes irreversible things. What happened next would be recorded imperfectly by 47 witnesses with 47 different vantage points and 47 different interpretive frameworks, and the accounts would never fully reconcile. What the majority agreed on was this: Horus Lupercal, Warmaster of Chaos, first and favored of the four, stood in the ruins of the processional for a period variously estimated between 90 seconds and 4 minutes, looking at the Eternity Gate, and then he turned to his Justarin and gave an order that none of them had expected, in a voice that some of them described as steady, and some described as broken, and most described, when pressed, as both. He ordered them back to the Stormbird. No tactical withdrawal, no strategic repositioning. He ordered them back with the flat, unambiguous finality of a man who has made a decision that he will not revisit, and the Justarin, who had followed Horus Lupercal through the worst of what the galaxy contained, and would have followed him into the Emperor's throne room itself, read something in his voice that made them obey without question, though several of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to name what they had heard. Abaddon did not move immediately. The lion watched the first captain look at his Primarch with an expression that moved through several stages in rapid succession: incomprehension, calculation, rage, and then something cold and self-contained that sealed itself behind Abaddon's eyes like a vault closing. And then Abaddon turned and followed the others, because whatever Ezekiel Abaddon had decided in that moment, and he had decided it privately, and its consequences would not be visible for a very long time. Horus walked toward the lion on his way to the Stormbird. He stopped when they were level. He did not look at the lion. He looked at the gate. "I was right about the Imperium," Horus said. "What it was becoming, what it will become." "Yes," the lion said, "you were." "That doesn't—" Horus stopped. Something moved in his throat. "It doesn't matter, does it, being right?" "Not always," the lion said. "No." Another silence. Briefer. Something in it that was its own kind of conclusion. "Don't let them make him a god," Horus said. He was still looking at the gate. "After, whatever comes after, don't let them make him into something he wasn't. He was a man who tried. He was wrong about things. He hurt people he loved." A pause. Don't let them sand that away." The lion looked at his brother for a long moment. "I'll try," he said. It was the most honest answer he could give, and Horus received it as such, with the slight fractional movement of something in his expression that might have been gratitude or recognition, or simply the acknowledgement of two beings who had told each other the truth in a place and moment that had not required it of them and had chosen to anyway. Horus walked to the Stormbird. The boarding ramp closed. The craft rose through the smoke of the burning processional and climbed into the sky and was gone. In the silence that followed, the lion stood alone in the rubble and looked at the Eternity Gate, damaged, scarred, standing, and at the custodians and imperial fists and dark angels around him, all of them equally still, equally uncertain whether what had just happened was victory or something more complicated, equally waiting for someone to tell them. The lion turned to face them. He had no speech prepared. The lion did not prepare speeches. He had, across his life, delivered exactly 3 addresses that he considered adequate to their occasions, and all 3 had been improvised from silence, because the right words, if there were right words, arrived only in the presence of the moment that required them, and could not be manufactured in advance. He looked at the faces around him, at the exhaustion and the wounds and the specific expression of people who have spent 17 days at the absolute limit of what they can sustain and are now being asked to process the fact that it might possibly be over. He said, "Hold the gate. Get your wounded clear, and someone find me a damage report on the sub-foundation. I want it before the hour is out." It was not a speech. It was not memorable. It would not be carved into any monument or preserved in any historical record as an example of rhetoric at the level of the occasion. But the Imperial Fist Sergeant nearest to him, a woman named Vara Cassian, who had held a 40-meter section of the outer processional wall for 6 hours with 11 soldiers and a heavy bolter that had jammed twice, looked at the lion with an expression that was not awe and was not gratitude, but was something more durable than either, and said, "Yes, my lord," and turned and began doing exactly that, and the others followed. Dorn's voice came through the Vox 20 minutes later. The traitor fleet was withdrawing, not broken, retreating in good order, which was the Iron Warriors and Sons of Horus all over, but retreating. The outer system engagements were resolving in the defenders' favor. The secondary assault vectors had failed to achieve their objectives. Terra was holding. The lion listened to all of it and said nothing until Dorn had finished. Then he said, "The northern wall?" "Held," Dorn said. "The Katabatic Gate?" A pause. "Held," something in the pause. "You were right about Perturabo." "I know," the lion said. Then, because it was true, and because Dorn deserved to hear it, "Your outer platform sacrifice bought us 6 hours we needed. The crews who held those positions won this as much as anyone." Another pause. Longer. "Yes," Dorn said. "They did." His voice carried something that Rogel Dorn's voice did not often carry. The specific weight of a man who has been holding himself together by force of will for months and is now, in the first moment that the immediate emergency has subsided, beginning to feel the cost of that. The lion understood it. He felt something analogous in himself, the slow, returning awareness of the body's accounting, the 17 days of continuous engagement beginning to present their bill in the form of a fatigue so complete it had moved beyond sensation into a kind of stillness. He sat down in the rubble of the processional. He looked at his bandaged hand. He thought about what Horus had said. Don't let them make him a god. And he thought about the throne room and the light that had come without warning and changed everything. And he thought about the Ouroboros protocol and the coordinate that Malcador had recognized and not named. And he thought about Perturabo walking away from the Katabatic gate, and about Abaddon's expression closing like a vault. There were threads here that did not resolve, variables still unaccounted for. The siege had ended, but the war had not, and the war, if he was honest with himself in the way that the lion was always honest with himself when no one was watching, had perhaps changed shape rather than direction. The Imperium had survived. But Horus had been right about what it was becoming, and the lion had said so to Horus's face, and now had to live in the space that honesty opened. The space of a man who has saved something he is not entirely certain deserved saving. Because the alternative was worse. Because sometimes the correct choice and the comfortable choice were not the same choice, and you made the correct one anyway. He looked up at the sky. The fires were burning out. Through the smoke, distant and cold, stars were becoming visible. The same stars that had been there before all of this, that would be there after, indifferent to the specific catastrophes of the beings living in the light they cast. Brother Holgast appeared beside him. The equerry's armor was the color of old wounds. He did not say anything. He sat down in the rubble beside his Primarch, with the comfortable silence of a man who had been in enough terrible places to understand that sometimes presence was sufficient. They sat together in the ruins of the processional and watched the fires go out. Somewhere behind the Eternity Gate, on his golden throne, the Emperor burned on. Somewhere in the retreating dark, Horus Lupercal flew toward a reckoning that the lion could not predict and had not tried to, because some things existed outside the reach of even the finest strategic intelligence, in the territory of choice and love, and the specific grief of a father and a son who had understood each other completely and still, somehow, arrived here. And somewhere in the darkness between systems, in a ship running without transponders, Ezekiel Abaddon sat alone with the decision that had locked itself behind his eyes like a vault. The lion noted all of it, filed it, waited. There was still work to do. There always would be. The Siege of Terra ended not with the clean resolution that history preferred to remember, but with the complicated, unfinished truth of things that had been survived rather than solved. Lionel Jonson had come to Terra 17 days before Horus, and done what he had crossed a burning galaxy to do, not save the Emperor, because the Emperor was beyond saving in any conventional sense, but hold the door, buy the time, ensure that what came after had something to come after, too. He had been right about the Katabatic Gate, right about the Alpha Legion network, right about Perturabo's doctrine and Horus's approach vector, and the precise moment when a word spoken honestly in rubble could accomplish what no sword could. He had also been right in the privacy of his own council about the thing he had said to Horus, that the Imperium was already becoming something its architect had not intended, that the victory they had won was a victory for a future that would be, in many ways, the disaster Horus had predicted, arrived at by a different route. The lion carried this the way he carried everything, quietly, without display, filed in the part of himself that was not strategy, but conscience, waiting for a moment when it could be acted upon rather than simply known. Dorn would build monuments. Malcador would write records. The Imperium would construct from the wreckage of these 17 days, a mythology that would serve its institutional needs and sand away everything Horus had asked him not to sand away. The lion would remember, he always did, in the deep vaults of the invincible reason, as the ship prepared to depart a Terra that had survived and would not forget, and would not entirely learn. The lion sat alone with the weight of a war that was over and a future that was not, and did what he had always done in the silence between things. He waited, he watched, he planned. The Emperor protects. Whether that meant anything now was a question the lion would spend a very long time considering. The Emperor protects. More stories await